Hello. The narrated lecture today will be all about social influence. Two forms of social influence that we'll be spending a considerable amount of time on in this narration will be conformity and obedience. Later, we'll talk about other forms of social influence having to do with essentially group dynamics. But let's start here. Conformity involves the situation when one changes one's behavior because of real or imagined group pressure. Obedience has to do with following commands from an authority figure in particular. So, conformity is something that we all do. The word doesn't have a particularly positive connotation. In fact, you might think it's sort of a negative connotation. But when we think negatively of conformity, we're really thinking of foolish forms of conformity. Conformity is very essential to basically the function of society. Okay, um, so we all need to conform to norms, to rules, to find out what the right or appropriate thing to do, often by looking at what others are doing. So conformity serves a functional purpose. Conformity refers to adjusting our behavior or thinking to fit within a group standard. Okay. Many components. So we can talk a bit about. I think we've talked about this before, perhaps in this course. Automatic mimicry. Okay. Social norms that affect how we think about the world and about our behavior in the moment. And then what are referred to as normative and social influence. Two terms that we will define and see the importance of very soon. So when we talk about mimicry, okay, as your textbook points out, it is not only true that birds of a feather flock together, it's also true that if we flock together, we might choose to wear the same feathers, if you will. Okay, so it's very interesting that this group of guys dress very, very similarly. Okay, in a sense, they are mimicking each other. Okay. Automatic mimicry is a very interesting phenomenon. Okay. And often our mimicry of other people is not by choice, but is actually quite automatic. So, for example, we all know about contagious yawning. We see people beside us, or perhaps a friend, or a group of friends yawning, okay, and we get an urge and an impulse to yawn, okay. There's also a contagion, if you will, having to do with folding arms, wringing hands, rubbing our face. These things we all mimic as we watch the behavior of others in our group. The adopting of regional accents, grammar, and vocabulary. Americans who have spent time in Great Britain, come back after a period of time, and we can detect a little British accent going on there. Okay, it happens sort of automatically. It's a form of mimicry. Okay, the same thing happens in reverse with English folks visiting for a long period of time the United States. Empathetic shifts in mood that fit the mood of the people around us. It's a form of automatic mimicry. Adopting the coping styles of our parents or our peers, including things like violence, yelling, withdrawal. This was something that was kind of broached a little bit when we talked about developmental psychology and about observational learning. Here's a study of what's called the chameleon effect on conscious mimicry. Okay, so in this particular study, a Confederate was a collaborator of the experimenter, intentionally rubbed his or her face or shook a foot, okay, as he or she engaged in a conversation with a naive participant uh, 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 in the study, okay, and this the result was that this kind of deliberate behavior, okay, which the Confederate had sort of been trained to do in this kind of systematic but very natural looking way, seemed to lead to a greater likelihood of the participants in the study doing the same behavior. So here are some data, okay. So in this is the number of times the participant either rubbed his or her face, okay, or shook his or her foot, okay. And so when the Confederate rubbed his or her face, okay, you see that participants were more likely to rub their face than when the Confederate when the Confederate, let me relook at this. I'm going to restart this, but okay, so the Confederate rubs, in the condition in which the Confederate rubbed his or her face on a number of occasions, the participant was more likely to rub his or her face than to shake his or her foot. On the other hand, when the Confederate had been sort of programmed or trained to like shake his or her foot on multiple occasions, participants were more likely to shake their foot than they were to rub their face. So whatever the Confederates seemed to be doing was more readily mimicked by the actual participants in the study. They were doing this, of course, very unconsciously. So, what form of social influence is the subject of this cartoon? Okay, so, and the answer here is conformity. Okay, so be like all your friends and express your individuality. Okay, and go in and so people become more likely to get it to you too, if in fact their friend had a tattoo. So yeah, that's conformity. Now, the most famous experiments, some of the most famous experiments in social psychology were undertaken many, many years ago in the early 1950s by a social psychologist by the name of Solomon Asch. And Asch's conformity studies were basically studies in which Asch was interested in seeing how strong social influence could be in the face of a perceptual reality which was very different than what the social influence was pushing people toward. So in this particular task, the task of the participants was to view two cardboard sheets, okay, two boards, okay, one of which had a standard line of a certain length, okay, and the other one of which had three comparison lines, okay. The task of the subject is to indicate which of the comparison lines is equal in length to the standard line, right? Now, in all cases, one of the lines fit the was the same line, and so the correct answer here, of course, is B. So basically, you know, this stimulus display would be presented. You'd be asked, so which line is the same? If you were a subject, and your answer, in all likelihood, would be B. Okay, same length as a standard line. Now, what went on here was that there were actually 6 different participants at any one time seated around a table, okay, a semicircular table. And at the front of the table, the experimenter would display these stimuli. He did it basically 40 times, okay, 40 different standard lines to be compared with 40 different comparison lines, sets of comparison lines. Now, so there's 6 participants, supposedly, and they answer in order, and they tell the experimenter verbally, orally, what their answer is. So let's say this stimulus set is presented. The first participant says B. The second participant says B. The third participant says B. The fourth says B. The fifth and the sixth. Everybody gets the right answer. Okay. Now, as it turns out, it gets the right answer because it's a pretty easy task. But as it turns out, the first 4 participants, okay, who answer are not real participants, they're Confederates, okay? And so they've been instructed to, on some of the trials, okay, to actually give the wrong answer. So after 3 or 4 or 5 trials in which everybody gives the right answer, here comes this stimulus, and the first subject says C, okay? For a so-called subject, actually a Confederate, but the real subject doesn't know. Keep in mind, the real subject is seated in position 5, so he's going to be the 5th person to answer. Okay, so the first apparent participant says C, the second one says C, the third one says C, the fourth one says C, and now it gets to the real subject. What's the real subject going to do? Go with his senses, or go with what the other group said. So Ash didn't expect too many people to conform to the answers of the majority of the others in these cases, because the perceptual test was a pretty easy one, right? Okay, I mean, so everybody's saying C, but the obvious perceptually true answer is B. So how often would people conform to what the other subjects, parent subjects, said? Okay, so keep that in mind. So that's the experiment. We're going to get... So when we're with other people and perceive a social norm, a correct or normal way to behave, our behavior may follow the norm rather than following our own judgment. Okay? So the norm that's set up in this particular trial is what the other people are saying. Ash's question is, are people going to follow their judgment or go with the norm? And here is an actual picture, okay, of subject 4, a respondent 4, respondent 5, and the last respondent. And here is an actual subject in the study. There were 5 people beforehand in this particular version. So this is the 5th subject. This is supposedly the 6th subject, the real one, the 7th. Okay. So Ash conformity studies, the question is, so I gave you the example. Okay. So this guy says, it was C. The first 4 people have also said C. Now, what's this guy going to say? Okay. And it was, the whole point here is this is such an obvious thing that indeed it's almost like these other 5 people in advance of the subject, these Confederates were saying, hey, that square has 5 sides. Okay. So everybody said C in the example I gave with the line. Now, what's the real subject going to do? Okay. Well, the Ash conformity studies, about 1/3 of the people, okay, well, I should say, the average participant responded with the wrong answer, quote, C, okay, about 1/3 of the time, okay. So basically, they went along with the group, even though it was so obvious that the group was wrong. Okay, they went along with the group. Okay, they're saying in their head, "What the heck is going on here?" Okay, but they conform. Okay, about a third of the time. Basically, I told you there were like 40 trials um, in these studies. 10 of the trials were so-called conformity trials, where the rest of the group, okay, the Confederates all gave the wrong answer. Okay, and so the question is, what's the real subject going to do? And basically, about 3 to 4 uh, um, times out of 10, okay, the average subject gave the conforming answer. Okay. So the participants went along with the clearly incorrect majority. Actually, the actual figure in his first study was 37% of the time. Out of the 10 trials, between 3 and 4 times, the average subject gave that answer. Now, about 25% of the participants never conformed. Okay, they were, we'll call them the nonconformists. Okay, but what that means is that 75% conformed at least once. Okay, and half of the subject conformed for at least half of the critical presentations. Okay, half of the conformity trials. Okay, so those are pretty big numbers when you consider how obvious this perceptual task was. And it was surprising to Asch, and he went on to do a number of studies trying to uh, play around with whether or not that could be suppressed and what basically psychological forces were behind this phenomenon of conformity against conformity in the face of a very different reality. So we can understand conformity based on Asch's, this kind of conformity based on Asch's subsequent studies in terms of the two terms I mentioned previously, normative influence and informational influence. So normative influence is the phenomenon or the process by which people conform because they fear the consequences of appearing deviant. Okay. So normative influence is based on our need for acceptance, our need to belong, and to avoid social rejection. So you've been reading about the belongingness needs. They're very powerful here. Okay, so people can. So even when we're dealing with complete strangers, okay, people fear at some implicit, perhaps unconscious level, social rejection. Okay. So we can see normative influence at work when Asch changed the study so that he introduced a condition in which on the conformity trials, some of the conformity trials, instead of all 5 or 4, depending on the study, we'll say 5, okay, instead of all 5 of the Confederates giving the obviously wrong answer, one of the people, okay, one of the Confederates who preceded the subject actually gave a different answer. Okay, that person said B instead of C. Okay, everybody else said C. Now B was the right answer. Okay, when that happens, okay, under those conditions, conformity dropped from about the conformity rate can drop from about 37%, as we saw, down to about 6%. And in fact, that number went that low even when the Confederate, okay, who didn't conform, the deviant, okay, instead of giving the right answer, actually gave the wrong answer in the opposite direction. So everybody said C, okay. The deviant says A, so we don't have a unanimous majority, okay. Under those circumstances, the real subject, the vast more than 90% of the time, just gives the right answer. Yeah, it's B. Okay, so you need this unanimity. Okay, it's got to be unanimous majority who's giving the wrong answer here. Okay, and what does that tell us? It tells us that the impact of this deviant All you need is a little bit of social support, okay, for not going along, and you don't go along. Okay, so that's understood most readily in terms of normative influence, conforming because you fear the consequence of appearing deviant. But if there's another deviant, okay, you've got some social support. Okay, publicity. So in the Asch studies, remember, it's public. Okay, people are give their answers out loud. Okay, when the real subject was allowed to give his or her answers privately, write them on a piece of paper. Okay, and then they actually throw the piece of paper out so that nobody would ever see it. Okay, um, conformity, when it was a private response, again, virtually disappeared in this extreme condition. So again, normative influence. Okay, if it's public, there's this fear of rejection. There's this compromising of the need to belong and things like that. Okay, so those suggest normative influence. Okay, now informational influence is people conforming because they believe others are correct in their judgments. Okay, so normative influence is based on, remember when I talked in previous lectures have talked about our need to understand and perceive that we control and understand our world. Okay, informational influence is based on those needs. Okay, so we need information. Okay, in order to, because we don't have it all and we want to be correct, we want to perceive that we control and understand things. So this has been studied in other kinds of conformity studies where you're able to manipulate, okay, the expertise of the um, of the group, okay, um, the confidence of the actual subject, and the ambiguity of the stimuli. Okay, the more ambiguous the stimuli are, okay, the more ambiguous the judgment, the much more likely the participant, a person, is to conform. Because if it's ambiguous, okay, unlike Asch's studies in which it was pretty perceptually clear, the more ambiguous it is, the more readily we conform. Okay, so for example, studies have been done in which just to give you one example, people are told that, well, we're studying people's ability to estimate numerosity. Okay, how large the crowd is, how many items are in a stimulus display. So people, and that this is an important kind of skill, and we're going to test you on the extent to which you're sort of good or bad at this task. And so what people are presented with are a bunch of, on a computer screen, are a bunch of displays of dots, okay, spread out in various forms of density, okay, and the task is to estimate how many there are. Okay, how close can you come to estimate how many there are? Okay, so some people are led to believe that on some preliminary trials that they're not real good at this. Okay, they make a lot of mistakes. The feedback they get is that even though it's not true, it's people are chosen randomly. They're told, you didn't do so well. It's very much below average. Okay, or wow, you're really good at that. So that affects people's confidence. Okay, and they're also able to manipulate the impression of expertise of the other people. We're pairing you up with some other people who have, turned out to do this really, really well, okay, or really, really poorly, okay. And then they also can, in that kind of study, manipulate just how ambiguous and difficult the task is. So what do you find? The less confident people are in their skill, the more they conform to the unanimous majority, given a very different kind of answer. Okay, the more expert they perceive the group to be, okay, the more likely they are to conform to it. And the more ambiguous the task, okay, the more people are likely to conform, particularly when they perceive others to be expert and their confidence to be low. That that bespeaks of informational influence. Why? Because indeed, um, you know, when you don't have much confidence, when the task is ambiguous, um, you need information. Okay, you need information to to help you make your decision, or at least you perceive you do. So you're searching for information. So when we don't have all the information and we want it, we're going to look to others, particularly if the others are perceived to be expert. There have been lots of conformity studies. So, for example, when people have been asked to judge the quality of a football strategy, okay, that is presented, okay, or how good a particular clothing style is, and they're presented, sketches of clothing and so on. And you find that people will conform to what others have said. An interesting thing, and this study was done in the 80s when there was even more of a kind of a gender difference. Um, so people were more likely to conform to what others' opinions were of the football strategies that they read about, these little vignettes of what we're going to do here, when the group consisted of males than when it consisted of females, who presumably don't know as much about football. When it was a fashion thing, okay, women were the women were more likely to exert conformity, social influence on the respondents than were the men, presumably because they're more expert. Okay, so you see, conformity can find its way um, into all kinds of decisions, and we can see how the roles of normative influence and informational influence play out here. All right, so we have a strong need to belong. Okay, and that's part of the of why conformity. This is normative influence in lots and lots of ways. Okay, so why do we conform when we're not necessarily only looking for information and needing information from others? Why does normative social influence happen? Okay, well, we're social animals. We have a need to belong, okay? And we can learn a lot from the evolutionary psychology perspective, okay? Um, so seeking bonds with others clearly aided survival in many ways. And so that kind of strain made its way into our human DNA, if you will, okay? Um, so um, wanting to belong, needing to belong allows us to get emotional support. It allows us to survive. Um, it allowed our ancestors to, again, to survive in terms of hunting and sharing food. It allowed for protection. Um, um, Having this need to belong was a way, if you had that clinginess to the group, okay, you would stay close to caregivers, you'd be more likely to survive. So there's lots of reasons for the need to belong to kind of be built into our human DNA. And the need to belong, has all kinds of good, if you will, normative influence. It leads to good things, loyalty to friends, teams, groups, families. But it also leads to um, things that maybe are not so desirable. This doesn't seem too bad. We change our appearance to win acceptance. Sure, we do. We stay in abusive relationships because of a need to belong, potentially. Need to belong might be related to joining gangs and whatnot. Okay, so these are some downsides, along with the upsides. Okay. Um, So we talk a little bit more about the need to belong as kind of like um, a bit of a digression into something uh, related to conformity, but much bigger than conformity as well for the moment. Then we'll move to obedience. So, for example, children. So when we talk about the need to belong, we're talking when we talked about this. We saw this in developmental psychology that you need, that attachments need to form in a positive, satisfactory, comforting kind of way, and when they don't, okay, we run into problems as human beings. So, children who are repeatedly moved away from their primary caretakers in childhood may have greater difficulty forming deep attachments in adulthood. People losing a loved one or moving away from a hometown can feel grief. Okay, of course they can. Something that's been studied in a lot in social psychology in recent years is what's called ostracism. Okay, being ostracized or cut off from social contact or excluded can lead to real physical pain. Uh, people can, by building social connections, overcome that. Okay. Whoops. I want to go up a bit. Now, ostracism is a powerful phenomenon. There's you need to read about this in one of the assigned modules on belongingness. But there's been an interesting approach to studying this has been what's called the um, cyberball. Okay, and it doesn't have to be cyber, but so studies are done where there's a group of like supposedly 3 or 4 subjects who are waiting for an experiment to start. Um, um, we won't do let's do the cyberball. Um, let's not do the cyberball. Let's do the precursor where people actually are throwing balls around. Okay. So the experience is going to be a while, and just wait here for 15, 20 minutes. And then there's this, there's this little plastic ball sitting around, and one of the subjects picks it up and starts tossing it around to another one. Say, we can do this. This is fun. Now, actually, 3 of the 4 are Confederates, okay? And so they all start playing catch and throwing the ball around, laughing, having a good time with it. And then the real subject, they stop throwing it to, let's say it's a female, to her, okay? And it's not coming to her. They're just playing among themselves and laughing and stuff. In effect, they're ostracizing her, okay? And they're complete strangers. Well, think about how that would feel, okay? And you'll get it, okay? So you can observe, if you watch people who are being ostracized, they start getting, really sour looks on their face, really look sad, really look like they've been rejected. Then the actual tasks of the study begin, okay? And what you find, okay, across many, many studies is people who've been ostracized in this really simple way by strangers express more anger, okay? They express more sadness and depression when they're taking tests, okay? And in some cases, their performance on actual tasks actually suffers in the immediate aftermath of the ostracism. So ostracism can be a really powerful bummer, if you will, in terms of people's psyche. And it just illustrates, again, the need to belong. Okay, obedience. So when we talk about obedience, we're talking about behavior that changes as a function of being commanded or ordered or told to do something, usually by authority. So Milgram's obedience studies, of course, are the most famous examples of the study of obedience and some of the most famous experiments in all of psychology, and indeed, not just social psychology, but in psychology as a whole. Make sure you watch the Milgram video at the Video Theater Content area. Very important to get a sense of what these experiments were about. I'm going to describe the basic experiment as you examine the next couple of slides, and then we will see the results. So this is Milgram's shock generator. And here's how the study goes. Two people show up for an experiment supposedly on learning and memory. And when they show up, the experimenter explains this is going to be a study looking at the effects of punishment on learning, on verbal learning. So one of you is going to actually be a teacher. You're going to try to teach the other person, help the other person learn, okay? Basically word lists, okay, or word associations. You're going to read these sets of words, okay, and then the individual is supposed to answer by giving the word that you're going to read pairs of words, the word that was associated with the word initially. Okay. The learner is going to try to do this task. Okay. You're going to be in separate rooms. At least in the first studies, that was true. Now, what's the punishment? Well, basically, the teacher, okay, is going to read the words, get the answer, and every time the learner gets the answer wrong, you're going to deliver an electric shock, okay? The teacher will deliver an electric shock, and it'll start at 15 volts, and for every incorrect answer, okay, it's going to escalate another 15 volts, okay? So the first incorrect answer, you hit this lever, that stays up so you know where you are. The second incorrect answer, you hit this lever, 30 volts. Third incorrect answer, 45, 60, 75, all the way up to 450 volts, okay? So this is they're showing, there's the machine, okay? Let me hook you up and give you an idea of what it feels like, okay? So both the learner and the teacher take a 75 volt shock, and oh, that was a little bit of a tingle, okay? And the shock generating machine, okay, actually has lists. This is slight shock, this is moderate shock, and you can see where we're going here, all the way to really bad time shock, okay, all the way to XXX, okay. So then, okay, so now you guys know the task. Now we're going to draw straws, and one of you is going to be the teacher, and the other one's going to be the learner who's going to receive the shocks and try to learn these lists. Okay. So one of the so let's say you're one of these people. You draw the short straw. You draw the long straw. You get to be the teacher. Okay. The other guy gets to be the learner. So you go back and you're into the other room, and the experiment allows you to watch the learner get strapped up to this machine with to a chair with his arm, with his hand basically strapped to one of the chair arms, okay, and then the electrodes where the shock will be received being attached, okay, so that he gets the shock. He gets a shock to his hand because it's up against it's strapped to the machine. Okay, it's strapped to the arm. Okay, so then they get started. Okay, now here's what happens. Okay, so keep in mind the learner. Okay, really, it's a rig drawing, and the learner is really not going to get shocked. Um, and But the subject doesn't know that the learner really is a confederate of the experimenter. Okay, who basically once he's all set up in that room, he gets released from that, and they set up a program tape recording, giving the responses, okay, that the supposed learner gives. Okay, so the learner misses a few questions. He starts with 15 shocks, goes to 30 with the second. The teacher whacks him with 45 volts for the third, 60 volts for the fourth mistake, etc. At 75 volts, the learner goes, oh, okay, when he makes a mistake. When he gets a 90-volt shock, oh, you know. And as the shocks get more and more intense, we get this scripted sets of protests, which sound very real. So at 150 volts, experimenter, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had a heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out. If it gets to the next one, let me out. Okay. And I'll let you read down all of the complaints and objections and screams. At 280 at 70 volts, we get an agonized scream. Okay, it gets increasingly intense, and it sounds like the guy's in tons of pain and in perhaps mortal danger. Okay, so Milgram's question is, how far, okay, would the average person go, okay, in this task? Now keep in mind, okay, the teacher is basically just just following instructions that the experimenter's right there in these studies, and the teacher might turn around after he hears the this, like maybe at 120 volts, saying, geez, um, do I have to keep doing this? And the experimenter would say, excuse me, yes, the experiment requires that you do so. Okay, so please continue, teacher. Okay, so they keep moving up the scale. And how far would it go? Now, Milgram had piloted this with, or run this study by many people, psychiatrists, psychologists, other kinds of so-called experts of human nature, and nobody predicted that the average person would go past maybe 150 volts. Okay, by that time they'd have enough. They'd say, no, I'm not going on. I quit. I'm sorry. You can find someone else to do this experiment. Okay. Nobody predicted that. So how many people Milgram asked, lots of experts, you think would go all the way to 450 volts? Okay. And most people kind of laughed and said, well, maybe 2%. And it might be like the sadists among us, sadistic kinds of people might do it. Well, the data revealed something quite different, as has become part of our cultural understanding of things. This is a fairly popularized, shall we, not popularized, but much of the public is familiar with this research, but not maybe many through their intro psych course or their social psych course. Okay, so what's going on here? What did he find? This is what he found. Okay. In the baseline results, the first experiment, he found that 65% of the participants went all the way to 50 volts and beyond. Because if it gets to 450 volts, By that time, the teacher, the learner isn't even responding. God knows what happened to him. Okay, and the experimenter will say, no, consider no response to be an incorrect response, and after so many seconds, deliver the next higher voltage. Once they get to 450, a lot of the participants just basically collapsed and said, "Oh my God, thank God it's over." And the experiment said, "No, no, teacher, please continue." Okay. Um, at 450 volts for every incorrect answer. So please ask the next question, and if you don't get an answer, deliver 450 volts. That would go on if they did that for 3 consecutive trials at 450 volts. Then the experimenter finally said, "Okay, you can stop now." Okay. 26 out of the first 40 subjects run in the first experiment went all the way to that level. Okay. So it was a shocking, no pun intended, level of obedience, okay, to this authority figure, okay. And, it's far more than 2%. And it wasn't just the bigots, and I'm sorry, not the bigots, but the sadists and the sort of crazy kinds of people who did this, okay. It was people from all walks of life. Got similar statistics with college students, with business people, with construction workers, with people from all walks of life, from other professors in other disciplines, um, all kinds of people from all walks of life. Okay, so there was nothing special about the people who did this massive level of obedience. Okay, um, and it wasn't that people were doing this wantonly. Okay, the only people who suffered in this experiment, okay, of course, the learner was just a Confederate who disconnected from the shock immediately, but the subjects suffered terribly. Okay, many of them cried. They begged the experimenter to, quote, let them stop. They engaged in nervous laughter. They tried to hit the button real fast, thinking that maybe that would lessen the shock. They were miserable. They were completely stressed out, and really devastated by what they were doing. They kept doing it. And so that's the lesson of the Milgram's studies. Okay. Now, so Milgram's participants were extremely upset. Okay. In fact, those in the control group who basically the experimenter wasn't there to tell them to continue. They just said, go as far as you think you should go. They stopped very early. Okay. But virtually all participants were tormented by the experience. Okay. There were no gender differences, and his basic findings have been replicated all over the world, basically. And here are some modifications. So this is Milgram's original study, 65% full obedience. Okay. If it was just an ordinary, so the experimenter is giving the instructions to continue a teacher, continue to shock. The experiment requires that you go on. It's my responsibility what happens, then please continue. Okay. Well, if those orders were given by just a regular old person or by an experimenter giving them over the phone, so if you didn't know the phone, you could kind of like cheat. Okay, you didn't get as much obedience. Okay, if the learner was placed close to, actually in sight of the teacher, okay. You get a reduction of obedience down to about 40%. But now we're still talking about 40% of the people shocking all the way to 450 volts when they can see this. This, of course, was acted out suffering and pain that they were causing. Okay. In one study, Milgram had them actually hold the learner's hand onto a shock plate, okay, to enforce the shock. That reduced it more, okay, but we still get 30% full obedience, okay. Teacher reads lists of words while another delivers the shock. Okay, so here the teachers continue even more. Okay, almost all of them continued because they're not actually delivering the shock. Now, a couple of other things, very social psychological things to watch. When the teacher chose the level of shock, well, it's up to you how much you want to shock them. Nobody went to 450 volts. Okay, um, almost no one. Okay, when the teacher watched a disobedient other teacher, two of them, okay, you get a pretty profound decrease. Okay, and teacher watches two others who obey. Well, okay, so here we get a sort of a conformity to what others are doing. They kind of like disengage them from this being caught in this um, web and trap of obedience. Teacher watches two others obey. Okay, um, so when you get observational learning, you still get that heightens the effect a little bit more. Okay, so these are very telling results. Okay, now, well, I should go back up. One thing I don't have up here is uh, so Milgram, when subjects asked, Milgram basically would the experimenter would say, "It's my responsibility." If the experimenter said, "It's your responsibility," you also got a significant decrease, a tremendous decrease. What happens to that guy? A tremendous decrease in obedience. So it's the whole idea of, it's someone else's responsibility. That seemed to be a pivotal kind of factor in this. Okay. So are we all Nazis? No, an individual's character can make a difference. Some people, depending on the situation, are far more obedient than others. Okay. Individuals with an authoritarian personality, rigid, dogmatic, sexually repressed, ethnocentric, intolerant of dissent. That's the definition of a authoritarian personality. They're somewhat more likely to be obedient than people in general are. Okay, so character counts. Okay, but nevertheless, the situation controlled most of the behavior in Milgram's studies. Okay, so there are exceptions. Okay, but the typical person, and of course, nobody believes that they would actually do it. Okay, there have been studies that have asked people, so what would you do? And almost no one says they'd go to 450 volts. Okay, so we got a profound fundamental attribution error going on here. People underestimate how powerful this situation was, and that is, they're the kind of person that would do this, but in the situation, it's a different story. So, what processes influence this profound obedience? Okay. Well, normative and social and informational social influence factors, obviously normative. Okay, so here you've got an authority figure, you've got an experimenter telling you to go on. It's a very strange situation. You've never been in this before. You don't want to, look like an idiot or someone who's kind of like, you don't really, you don't want to incur the disapproval um, of the rejection of the experimenter. Okay, so that's a normative factor. But then there's also informational influence. This is a strange situation, to say the least. So people don't have a recourse to, experience, recourse to knowledge about what to do in this case, and so they look for information. Who has all the information? The experimenter. The experimenter says, "Don't worry. These, although they might be painful, they will not harm this individual. It's important to the experiment, to the study that you continue. It's I'm taking responsibility. So basically, that's informational influence. Okay. There's also extreme stress and arousal. These poor people, these poor teachers were stressed to the max, okay, and physiologically aroused. And when we get stressed to the max and very aroused, okay, um, physiologically, it's hard to think straight. We get tunnel vision. We start acting on the basis of automatic sort of impulses, going with the flow, if you will. Okay, um, and so we're not able to be really think this through rationally, and we respond in more kind of automatic, impulsive kinds of ways to powerful cues in our environment. In this case, the experimenter ordering them to continue. Okay. In effect, we respond on the basis of the obedience habit. Okay. Our default kind of response is to obey. Okay, that's instilled in us very, very early in life. Okay, and usually it's functional to obey. We obey our parents. We obey other authority figures like cops. Okay, clergymen. Okay, um, teachers, etc., etc. People who are in positions of authority, and it becomes a habit. It comes built into us to obey. Okay, so it's the obedience habit. It becomes an automatic heuristic response. Okay, the problem with that is, of course, sometimes we miss that. It usually serves us well to obey. Okay, to be obedient. Okay, but if we misapply the heuristic, if we use it in other situations where we shouldn't, okay, then we might run into a a Milgram kind of situation. Okay, but the whole thing that Milgram concluded was that the obedience orientation that we have, that we're socialized into having, okay, um, can, under certain circumstances, cause us to go way too far. And then there's a role of responsibility. Okay, when the responsibility for what happened to that man, the learner, the teacher, could be pushed away, then it becomes a little bit easier. The pressures to pull out of this become a little bit easier to resist, if you will. Okay. So when you think about these factors, and the textbook makes the connections to, uh, what happened in the Holocaust, what happened in Nazi Germany, what's happened in various forms of awful instances of obedience that you can read about in the textbook. Okay. Um, okay. Let's go back. All right. So this has gotten to be a very long narration, so I'm going to stop here. But I'm going to continue with more forms of social influence in the next narration.